with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And this exchange between Di-Fi, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and a bunch of grade schoolers and their teacher, and frankly,
it's hysterical.
The quality of the rhetoric from the grade schoolers and the teacher are indistinguishable.
Were they there to sell Girl Scout cookies and interrupt her, or did they have a purpose and a point to go to her office?
They were there with a letter that says Di-Fi should sign on to AOC's GND, or else, because we only have 12 years, they've been fully inculcated with the AOC propaganda. We only have 12 years, and they're our future and all that. Di-Fi, she's in her late 80s now, and she's less inclined to take guff than she used to be, particularly from grade schoolers. Listen to this exchange.
We are trying to ask you to vote yes on the Green New Deal.
Please.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We have our own Green New Deal.
Some scientists have said that we have 12 years to turn this around.
Well, it's not going to get turned around in 10 years.
I think that is AOC right there.
Senator, if this doesn't get turned around in 10 years, you're looking at the faces of the people who are going to be living with these consequences.
The government is supposed to be for the people and by the people and all for the people.
You know what's interesting
about
this group is I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. You come in here and you say it has to be my way or the highway. I don't respond to that.
Awesome.
I've gotten elected. I just ran. I was elected by almost a million vote plurality. And I know what I'm doing. So, maybe people should listen a little bit.
I hear what you're saying, but we're the people who voted you. You're supposed to listen to us. That's your job. I'm 16. I can't
vote. You didn't vote for me.
Well, I'm 24.
It doesn't matter. We're the ones who's going to be impacted.
Something.
It doesn't matter. We're going to be the ones who's all impacted.
I understand that. I have 7 grandchildren. I understand it very well.
Senator, the cost of not taking this action is far higher than the cost of what the Green New Deal will be. And there is enormous popularity for this bill around the whole country. And we're asking you to be brave and do this for us and for your grandchildren.
Get enough for everybody. I'm trying to do the best I can, which was to write a responsible resolution.
Any plan that doesn't take bold, transformative action is not going to be what we need.
Well, you know better than I do. So I think one day you should run for the Senate.
Great,
and then you do it your way.
But by that time,
in the meantime,
there's going to be a big problem.
I just won a big election.
Now, who dropped their passy?
This is every debate on the Senate floor. I mean, this is so great. A bunch of grade schoolers that are adults and grade schoolers that are actual grade schoolers having the idiotic fact-free debate where they just sort of exchange catchphrases with one another. And it's perfect.
And they think just because they voted for her that she's going to do what they wanted. And storm her office like that? Good for Dianne Feinstein.
And speaking of grade schoolers, AOC was omnipresent as usual at the Girls Who Code event.
Girls Who Code?
Yeah. Oh. She talked about her own insecurities that she had to get over when she ran in the primary, and a mean email that she got that really was freeing for her, because it said, I don't care. It told her, I don't care what people think. I don't care who endorses me. I'm going to step up because nobody else is stepping up. So this is AOC, the boss lady. Listen to this little temper tantrum.
It was every critical, horrible thing that I was already saying to myself, that I was already battling when I was getting up out of bed. It was the voice, it was me looking at myself in the mirror, externalized in an email. And that moment was actually really freeing, because I read it and it was like, it's your worst fear. It's especially when you feel like imposter syndrome. It was your worst fear, feeling like someone was going to find you out as like a fraud. Yes. And I read it and I was like, you know what?
Fraud, yes.
I don't care anymore. I don't care anymore. Because, again, I'm at least trying.
Wash that man right out of my hair.
So the power is in the person who's trying, regardless of the success. If you're trying, you've got all the power. You're driving the agenda. You're doing all this stuff. Like, I just introduced Green New Deal 2 weeks ago, and it's creating all of this conversation. Why? Because no one else has even tried. So people are like, oh, it's unrealistic. Oh, it's vague. Oh, it doesn't address this little minute thing. And I'm like, you try. You do it.
Right. You do it.
Because you're not.
You do it.
You're not. So until you do it, I'm the boss.
I'm the boss. I'm in charge.
Look at me.
I mean,
it's a communist plan that she came up with. No airlines. You have to take a train.
Distinguish her and that rhetoric from those fifth graders in Di-Fi's office. Can you? I can't. All right. To elevate the conversation, maybe introduce some scientific data into the discussion on climate change. We're pleased to be joined again by Bjorn Lomborg. He's the director of the Copenhagen Consensus think tank. He's also the author of the book Cool It and Skeptical Environmentalist. Bjorn, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. It's good to be here.
So you actually addressed AOC in an op-ed in the New York Post, I remember, from late last month, about the things that AOC could use to inform her understanding of what exactly the science is and then what reasonable public policies in response to it would be. Could you provide your suggestions for our friend Ocasio-Cortez?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to recognize that while global warming is an issue, it is a real problem. It is by no means the way that it's being typically portrayed, the end of the world. Ocasio-Cortez was quoted to say, we just have 12 years left to turn this around. If not, this is the end of the planet. And it's just nowhere true. This is a problem, but not the end of the world. Let me give you a sense of the size. The Nobel laureate from last year was the first Nobel laureate in economics who got it in climate economics. So he probably knows what he's talking about. He tells us basically what the UN Climate Panel has also said, that if we don't do anything about global warming, the total cost, the total impact of global warming by the end of the century will be equivalent of a loss of income somewhere between 2 and 4%. That's a couple of recessions over the next 80 years. That's a problem, but it's by no means the end of the world. And remember, we'll most likely be somewhere between 300 and 1,000% richer by then. So it is an issue we should tackle, but of course there's a real risk, and that's what her plan does, is basically throw an enormous amount of money at this problem and actually ending up spending more to solve less of the good you can actually get out of the problem. That's, of course, just bad policy.
Well, what do you think is the craziest part of her plan?
Well, I mean, look, and you also had her say this. It's actually, in some way, a wonderful conversation opener because it says what everybody has been sort of talking about for a long time. Let's get rid of fossil fuels. Let's just stop everything. The problem is, Bloomberg tried to make an estimate of how much would this cost. It would cost $2.1 trillion per year. That's pretty much the entire tax intake of the U.S. That's a huge income cost. And what would that generate? Well, it would reduce temperatures by the end of the century, even if she was totally successful, by 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So, instead of getting 7 degrees Fahrenheit increase, we would get 6.7 degrees Fahrenheit. We almost wouldn't be able to measure the impact in 100 years after asking Americans to pay $2.1 trillion a year. And that's, of course, why this is just simply unrealistic. That's not a small flaw in her plan. It's, the gaping hole in the plan.
Well, isn't it also a challenge that we're sort of not the main offenders, even though we're the largest consumer of energy? And so unless you got, and I'm not suggesting that anybody should buy into AOC's plan, but until and unless you get countries like India and China to be serious about reducing emissions, you're not going to make a sustainable impact on the problem as you describe it.
Yes, exactly. And of course, she would argue back to say, well, we're going to showcase the world how to do this, and we're going to, take the lead, and then everybody will want to follow. But of course, what will actually happen, and we've already seen this in Germany, which tried to do the same thing 10, 15 years ago, they basically made the worst of all possible worlds. They've spent an enormous amount of money and almost not cut their CO2 at all. That's just not the way to lead the world. That's a warning sign. So what the U.S. would show if you were to embrace the AOC plan is basically to tell India this is not how to do it. And that, of course, also tells us how we should be thinking about this. If we were to do what the U.S. has done through its history, you've not challenged issues or you've not changed issues by saying, could you please do less of this? Could you please, you just mentioned, Amy, that we shouldn't be flying anymore. That's just not going to work. And you're not going to solve these problems by saying, could you please not fly? Could you please not turn on the light? Could you please have it less convenient? What you have done is to do this through innovation. If you can innovate greener technology so that it's cheaper than fossil fuels, of course you can get both China and India and everybody else to switch. That's what you've done with fracking, because you managed to find a technology that could basically make gas cheaper than coal. You have reduced coal consumption so much that the U.S. has actually cut its CO2 emissions more than any other country in the world. Now, that's amazing. And, of course, that's not because you're terribly concerned about global warming. That's just simply because it also made great business sense. So if we could get China and India fracking, and, of course, in the long run, if we could get everyone off fossil fuels because we had innovated cheaper green energy, then we can solve it.
Yeah,
that's what AOC and everybody else should be focusing on.
Right, innovation, not Earth Hour 24/7. Let me let me get to this other issue, though, to the argument they make, because you've addressed this before, and it's really important because it plays to the sentimentality of people's approach to public policy. The idea that climate change is impoverishing poor people, further impoverishing them, further continuing cycles of poverty around the globe, including in portions of America. And I remember scholarship you've done on the topic where you actually address this concept that AOC should be familiar with since she's such an economics wonk, opportunity cost, the potential impact on poverty for some of the policies, government policies being proposed by people like her.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that are really hard about global warming is to recognize that global warming will harm the poorest, both in the rich world and in the poor world, the most. That's not predominantly because it's global warming, but that's because every bad thing harms really poor people the most because they don't have any ability to be resilient. And so the real issue is if you start saying, no, you can't have coal-fired power, you can't actually work your way out of poverty, which is what a lot of these policies end up meaning in third world countries. You leave these people in poverty. Now, you also cut temperatures a little bit, but of course they're going to be much worse hit by the end of the century. Instead of focusing on making these people rich, instead of taking the worst hit people in the world out of poverty and making sure that they can actually have meaningful lives, which both means that they would be less vulnerable to climate, but of course also less vulnerable to everything else. They could give their kids education and get them to not die from easily curable infectious diseases and all these other things that not being poor can actually help you with. So it's crucial to recognize you're not going to solve global warming by telling Indians and Chinese, I'm sorry, you can't be rich, you can't use fossil fuel energy. What you have to do is to understand they want to be rich, they have a moral right to become rich. And what you should make sure is that they can then get the innovations we were just talking about, get cheap green energy so that they can both be rich and not emit CO2 in the long run.
He is Bjorn Lomborg. He's the director of the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He's also the author of Cool It and Skeptical Environments. Bjorn, thanks again for joining us. Always appreciate it.
Hey, great to talk to you.
Take care.